Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'll start with just a bit of housekeeping while there's still a few people connecting. Now, I know most of us are pretty used to Zoom meetings by now, but I wanted to note that for this one, we're using a webinar format, which means that your videos and microphones are off, so you don't need to worry about muting yourself. Having said that, we'd still love to hear from you, so please feel free to say hello using the chat button at the bottom of your screen. And you can also use that chat button to share comments throughout the presentations. Now, when you're looking down at the bottom of the screen, you'll also see that there's a Q&A button next to the chat bubble. The Q&A button is the one to use to post questions for our speakers. And we do encourage you to post questions throughout the webinar, and we'll direct them to the speakers at the end. Now, you will have noticed that we're recording this session, and we'll send a link out in an email next week, along with any links or supporting material from our speakers. So, with the housekeeping done, we're ready to get started for real. So again, welcome everyone to Data for Good's webinar, which we've organized to support the United Nations World Wildlife Day. I'm Veronica Coyle from Data for Good, and I'm speaking today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And my behind-the-scenes host, Samantha, is joining from the lands of the Darawal Nation. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we are gathering today. We pay our respects to the elders of these lands, past, present, and emerging. Now, as I've said, Samantha and I are from Data for Good. And for anyone that doesn't know Data for Good, we're a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to inspire and enable people so that we can use our skills and passion to benefit humanity. Our webinar series is one way that we do that, but we also connect volunteers with data skills with not-for-profits that have data projects, which means that the not-for-profits can focus more on providing services that benefit people and the planet. And for more information about Data for Good, you can just visit our website, dataforgood.com.au. I'm really excited because we have two fabulous speakers for you today. So let me introduce our first speaker, Professor Richard Kingsford, who is the Director of the Centre for Ecosystem Science at the University of New South Wales. He is also a river ecologist and conservation biologist who has worked extensively across the wetlands and rivers of the Murray-Darling and Lake Eyre basins. He's leading the reintroduction or rewilding project, Wild Deserts, in Sturt National Park in New South Wales. He also researches ways of implementing effective conservation actions through developing adaptive management approaches and engagements with communities. Professor Kingsford, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sorry about the hiccups. And if you were expecting me to talk about water, I'm sorry. I'm not going to be talking about water today. So this is a really exciting project that we've got in northwestern New South Wales called Wild Deserts. And it really stems from the big problem we've got in Australia with extinction of small mammals. And there are about 27 species that we've lost across the continent since European colonisation. And, you know, the main culprits are feral cats, which came onto the continent in the late 1800s, and foxes in the 1900s. So our project is right up in the corner of New South Wales. You can see the bottom left there, you've got Queensland and South Australia and Sturt National Park. And then the main part of it shows that we've sort of got that corner of Sturt National Park that we're managing. And the lines around there are two fenced areas and what we call a wild training area zone, which I'll talk about a bit more. And I have two people who live out there, a lovely couple, Beck West and Reese Pedler and their baby. There's another one on the way, but they manage this extraordinarily large area that we've got that we're doing this project in. So as I mentioned, there's two exclosures to keep animals out, that's feral animals, named after the First Nations languages there, the Thipa meaning alive in Wonkamara, and Minku meaning good, happy in Malinyapa. And then we fenced off the corner of New South Wales, a massive area of more than 100 square kilometres, which is what we call the wild training zone. And I'll explain what this is all about. We have built feral proof fences around the area with gates that will stop even the most ambitious cat, fox or rabbit. And that's essentially what we're focusing on. In this part of the world, a lot of the fauna and flora that was there is no longer there. When Charles Sturt went through in 1845, he found lots of small mammals, and traditional owners who had small mammals as their staple, and many of these are now locally extinct, but they're not just the mammals, but birds and reptiles. So we've got a project to reintroduce 7 locally extinct mammals, and you can see bilbies up there, but right down to western quolls over a 10-year period. And it's a very exciting project to be involved in. If you think about the desert ecosystem as it is in a degraded state, you've got dingoes in Queensland and South Australia, but you've got foxes and cats that feed on small mammals and reptiles and birds, and we've lost a lot of mammals that way. And then too many kangaroos are overgrazing. So you've got this really sort of degraded desert landscape. And what happens then is when in New South Wales, in Tibooburra anyway, where the Sturt National Park is, there are no dingoes. So there's no top predator in that system. And as a result, we have overgrazing occurring. And this is some work that we did with a PhD student, where we looked at the effects of kangaroos. And as kangaroo numbers went up, we found that things like seed-eating bird numbers went down because there wasn't enough grass there, and you have these major changes occurring. So it's not just the lack of mammals there, there is a quite degraded desert landscape there. So what we're aiming to do is start with this sort of landscape with kangaroos, rabbits, and a few small mammals and invasives. There were pigs there and goats, foxes and cats and rabbits. And then create some fenced exclosures to keep them out, where we put our 7 species. But ultimately, we're keen to reintroduce these beyond the fences. And this is a wild training zone where we do have a few feral animals, but we control their numbers. So this sort of complicated picture is where we think the future will be in the next 20 years. So we've got the 2 exclosures there with our 7 species, and then the wild training zone in the corner of New South Wales, which will have a few cats, foxes and rabbits. In South Australia, you've got horses and cattle and cats and dingoes, and also in Queensland. And then below Sturt National Park, you've got pastoral areas. And of course, these locally extinct species, we want to establish this sort of haven for them up there, but also train them up to be ready to deal with some of these predators. We have a vision for wild deserts to understand, restore and promote desert ecosystems through ecosystem manipulations, reintroductions and collaborative partnerships. Now I'm going to hand over to Sam to just show you a small video of when we reintroduced bilbies last year.
This country means everything to me and my people. It looks after us, and so we try to look after it.
So last night we reintroduced greater bilbies to wild deserts, the first 10 bilbies to come back to this area in probably over 150 years. And it's a very emotional moment and very rewarding to be able to stand there and watch the traditional owners releasing the first bilby.
Bilbies are really, if you like, the foundations of restoring this desert, because they are the engineers. They're what we call ecosystem engineers. They'll start to transform this place.
Bilbies play a really important role in turning over the fragile soils across Australia.
Just within one day you can already see their burrows and their diggings are turning the soil over, and that's increasing soil carbon. So they're really important keystone species to have back in the ecosystem.
Just to see the bilbies, we call them Sturt, being released today back onto this land, it was very magical. It took my breath away, and for me it means that the land's healing itself. It was a very special moment for me.
So not only are we introducing these bilbies, some of you might have noticed like a bandage on the tail of that bilby. That's actually a radio transmitter, so we can track them and check on them, and they're all doing well and breeding up there. But we're also checking to see what's happening to other animals and plants, to understand how the system can be restored. Rewilding is not just about bringing these animals back in like a zoo, it's actually trying to understand what's happening to the ecosystem. And so part of that is thinking about how we bring them in, what sort of order. So you would have seen we brought the bilbies in first as ecosystem engineers. Also another small predator we've introduced there called the crested mulgara. And our next stage is to reintroduce some of the bandicoots, the golden bandicoot, the western barred bandicoot, and finally the predators, which is in this case, the western quoll. And so we're going to be measuring how we're doing, and obviously this is data for good, and we collect data. So we want to know what's happening to the plants. We want to know how close the plants are to the sort of shelter that animals are using, what's happening to the invertebrates and reptiles and other mammals that are there. For example, there are other predators. There are womma pythons there that will eat some of these small mammals. We want to know what happens to them. What's happening to the shelter, the density of bushes. These are all measures of how we're rewilding that ecosystem. And then in terms of the predators, outside the exclosure, what's happening to the cats, foxes and dingoes if we're measuring those in South Australia. And so measuring ecosystems responses is a very important part of that. And each one of these dots, coloured dots that you see there, are places where we're measuring all those things I talked about. And for each one of those dots, we measure a 1 kilometre square quadrat, which one bit's on the top of the dune and one's on what we call the swale, the bottom of the dune. And we have different management treatments, and we have reptiles, frogs, invertebrates, vegetation and bird transects that we're measuring once a year. So there's lots of data that's coming together, and it's like a grand experiment. There are places that we've got these animals, but there are also places that we don't, so we can compare and contrast. Part of what we've also been doing is getting rid of the feral animals, and that was a big job. Beck and Reese mapped over 1,000 rabbit warrens across the 2 exclosures, then went to each one of those and checked if they had rabbits or not and removed those rabbits. They trained their dog to be a rabbit detector dog so that we could make sure that every last rabbit was out of there. And we were able to declare those feral free on the 13th of September and the 27th of February, which is great because it meant that we could confidently bring back those locally extinct mammals. One of the other things that we're introducing there is innovative predator control, particularly for cats, because cats are very difficult to control. And one of our researchers, Dr. John Reed, has developed these grooming traps, which essentially call in cats with baby rabbit noises or mating cats or birds. And then once that cat is detected, there is an onboard computer that analyzes that it's a cat and separates it from a non-target, and then is able to put some gel on that cat, which it then will lick off and die very soon afterwards. So they are one of our big challenges. The other thing that I mentioned at the beginning was that we're really interested in getting these animals to be less naive about predators. And you can see this particular bettong is very friendly towards a human, and that's a problem. So we were trying to make these animals better at living out in this world and sharpening up their anti-predator skills. And there's a couple of pieces of work that have been done by people on our research team, and they basically showed that if you have cats with these animals, you don't, at very low levels, you can educate these animals to be more predator aware and escape more often. And so that's the grand plan in that wild training zone. So if you remember that wild training zone that I was talking about, that blue area, once we bred up the numbers in the pink areas, the 2 exclosures, those locally extinct mammals will be allowed out into that wild training zone. And over time, we expect them to become much more predator aware because there will be cats, foxes and rabbits there. And we will have other places that we're monitoring these animals to see whether they're more or less predator aware depending on where they're living. So the way this works is that over a 10-year period, we're expecting to reintroduce these 4 species into that wild training zone, and possibly the other 3 later on, and see them increase over time. At the same time we're doing that, we're also going to be monitoring the feral animals out there and controlling them and their numbers in terms of also understanding what feral cats are doing, because they're the most dangerous, making sure that the felixes that we have in place can keep them at low levels. And then over a long period of time, we expect those numbers to be stable, even in very productive times, so that they don't increase and allow the locally extinct mammals to not only increase, but also be more aware of what predators are in this landscape. So the other parts of our project are about, what are we doing in terms of learning? I've talked about the science that we're doing, but we're working with the First Nations people, the Wankamara and the Malinyapa groups in terms of cultural surveys, but also interpreting country. We have fantastic groups of volunteers that help us do a whole range of things out there in terms of measuring what's going on. We also have PhD and honours students who work on various things from soils to understanding more about the bilbies and their reintroduction. We're hoping in the future to have people working on feral cats. And we have a very active program engaging with our neighbours. These are landholders. Some have never seen some of these animals before, but we're also working with the schools out there. And finally, we are starting to establish a campground out there and an interpretation area. And we're going to have some wonderful huge sculptures there of some of these animals that we've made out of fencing wire that was left over. So we think there's going to be a wonderful opportunity up there for people to see restoration underway. We're also very active in terms of media and publications. And so we've got a Facebook site. We've got pretty good coverage in the sorts of things that we're doing, like the bilby release. So just in summary, and there's a website there that you can visit and get some more information. This is a big partnership with the New South Wales government over 10 years and potentially longer. We are really at the cutting edge in terms of the next big thing in terms of rewilding or reintroduction biology, where we're establishing threatened mammals and restoring desert ecosystems. We're using the most innovative ways of controlling the feral animals, particularly the cats. We're going to be making some of these locally extinct mammals more aware of what a feral predator is, so that our vision is that they can reinvade the desert and take it back, if you like, from those ferals. And obviously we have a very rigorous approach to our scientific monitoring. And we're very much into opportunities to educate the public, and this is a great opportunity, and raise awareness about what we're doing here. Great, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now.
That's great, thank you, Richard. I love very much that you are taking a whole of ecosystem approach. So just a reminder to participants to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to enter any questions, and we will have a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. So let me introduce our next fabulous speaker, Dr. Jodi Rowley, who is the Curator of Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Biology in a joint appointment with the Australian Museum and the University of New South Wales. Her research seeks to uncover and document biodiversity, understand its drivers, and inform conservation decisions. She has greatly expanded knowledge about amphibian species diversity in Southeast Asia, having led over 25 expeditions in the region and co-discovered more than 24 new frog species. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jodi Rowley. Over to you, Jodi.
Thank you so much. I will just share my screen. So I am here to talk about something that has a lot of data and definitely opportunities to try and increase the, I guess, outcomes for conservation with some help from people with data skills. And that is a project called FrogID, but I will start at the beginning first and explain to you a little why FrogID, why frogs. I mean, I'm just obsessed with frogs because I think they're amazing, but actually aside from that, I've dedicated much of what I do to frog conservation because they're in a lot of trouble. So globally, more than 40% of all amphibians are threatened with extinction. In Australia, we have an absolutely terrible track record as well. We've already lost at least 4 species, and there's more than 30 species that are kind of hanging on the edge of extinction. And so we really desperately do need to conserve frogs. But one of the biggest challenges we face is that we sort of don't really know that much about them. And why should we care, I guess, the bigger problem as well. Why should we care about frogs? If frogs disappear, will that be a problem? Will we notice? Well, frogs are actually both a great bioindicators. So they're an indicator the environment's doing well. So by monitoring frog populations, you can get an understanding, particularly in freshwater ecosystems, how things are doing. But they're also a really important part of ecosystems. They eat a lot of invertebrates, including pest species. Their tadpoles also eat a lot of algae. And unfortunately, from the places where they have disappeared, we understand that nothing sort of steps up and fills the role of frogs. So there is a sort of a big hole left in the ecosystem. And then all the other animals that rely on frogs and tadpoles for food also start to decline as well. So they are important parts of the ecosystems. They should be really abundant, and they're in trouble. And Australia's frogs are also really unique. Almost every species occurs nowhere else on Earth. And as I alluded to, we've got a big problem in frog conservation is that we don't know that much about them. So in the background here is a map, little grey dots. You can see Sydney on the middle right. The grey dots are records of frogs on the map. And this was all the records that we had in the sort of national biodiversity data sort of aggregate, the Atlas of Living Australia, before the FrogID project. And what you can see here is while there are sort of records of frogs around Sydney, there are huge parts of Australia, not that far from Sydney, hundreds of kilometres, where there actually are no records of frogs. And that is, of course, a challenge when it comes to creating conservation reserves, understanding the impacts of development. We simply don't know what frogs are where. And frogs don't always make themselves super known. A lot of them rely on rainfall to actually be out there and calling. So if you need to rapidly find out what is there, you might not be in luck. Most of the frogs might be underground and being pretty quiet. As I also alluded to, though, when frogs are active, they make a noise. So male frogs call to attract female frogs. And if you hear a frog in your backyard, it's yelling out, it's a male frog calling to female frogs to attract them to breed with them. And each species has a different call. And I guess that makes sense. You don't want to attract the wrong species because that's a waste of everyone's time and effort. And so frogs are essentially out there yelling out what species they are. And simply by listening to the call, frog biologists like myself can identify which species is which. As an example, I'll play the striped rocket frog call. This is a species that occurs in northern Australia, down to Sydney. And the graceful tree frog. So you can see that these two guys have completely different calls. And in fact, calls can actually be the best way of identifying some Australian frog species. So this is two species of Australian green stream frog. They look really, really similar, and the kind of differences you can see that can just be attributed to kind of natural variation. But when you actually play the calls actually sound really different. So this is the Barrington tree frog. So the and then this is its relative, which occurs in Sydney, the leaf green stream frog. So while you might see these guys, and actually it is really hard to see these guys, just by listening, you're able to figure out who's who. And the other thing is you don't have to get your feet wet, you don't have to get in the water, and you don't have to disturb the frog. So with all that in mind, we created a project at the Australian Museum called FrogID, which is a national citizen science project that's all based around a free app for your smartphone, iOS or Android. And it does have a field guide with photos, and we keep it super up to date. So a new species was just officially recognised about a week ago, and the next day it was in the app. So it's a really great field guide to take with you. But the primary aim of FrogID is to allow people across Australia to record and submit the calls of frogs. And at the moment, every recording is identified by a team of experts. And so this is both fantastic, but it is also, we are hoping for machine learning one day in the future. So all you do is get out there, press record, 20 to 60 seconds. It's a photograph of the app, and then submit it. Now, what do we get on the other end? So looking at a kind of behind the scenes, we've got a CMS that we can actually look at everything associated with the call. So the app automatically uploads the latitude and longitude, which the phone gives you, with an idea of accuracy as well. So for example, this is a recording that I made down a gorge in the New England tablelands of New South Wales. I didn't have mobile reception, so you don't need mobile reception. Phones are crazy and they know where you are without that. And that was the first record of a frog that had ever been made in that gully. And it was accurate to 6 meters. And in this particular instance, it was a little redback toadlet calling. So I can play that call, I can download that call, analyze it in software as well if I need to, and sometimes we do need to, and identify the calls. And then also, if it's not me, I might give a comment to the person to say, wow, this is really fantastic, thank you. They might also submit notes, photos, things like that. So it's not just an audio recording, it's geo-referenced, time-stamped, and sometimes has other data associated with it as well. And FrogID was launched over 3 years ago now, in November 2017. And when we launched it, I mean, I guess I didn't know, you don't know, like how many people are going to help, how many people are going to join this fight to save frogs, to get the information that we need to help better understand and conserve frogs. If it was just me doing it, probably 5 of my friends and, my mum and dad would have used it. Thankfully, there was a fair bit of promotion, and I guess it's also, restored my faith in the fact that actually people really do care about frogs too, and they do care about wildlife, and it is easy to make a contribution, and they are. So thank you everyone out there that's used FrogID. In the last 3 and a bit years, this is a map of all of the records that we have received via the FrogID project of frogs. And obviously it's a bit of a population map because that's where the people are, but it's still some absolutely amazing recordings from really remote places as well. And so far, more than, hundreds of thousands of people have actually downloaded the app, and more than 21,000 people have actually submitted a recording of something. Not all of these are actually frogs. We do get a few insects, but we've had over 21,000 people submit recordings to the project. And this has been 216,000 and growing actual recordings that are submitted, which have resulted in over 350,000 records of frogs in just over 3 years. And this is kind of amazing. Before FrogID, we had about 500,000 records of frogs in Australia, but there's a lot of issues with the data because it was, many instances it would be collected in New South Wales or in southern Sydney, or, it wouldn't have an exact GPS location. The identifications were often wrong because many frogs look really similar, and it wasn't possible to sort of go back and check. That's the amazing thing about the FrogID data. It has the audio. You can go back and listen and determine whether or not it really is that. So 350,000 records of frogs. And obviously that's more than the number of submissions received, because we usually have more than one species of frog calling in a recording. And I think it's up to about 12 species now that 12 or 13 species have been detected in a single audio recording, which is amazing. And so far, out of just over 240 species of frog in Australia, we haven't, the people of Australia have detected over 200 of them, which is pretty remarkable. And some of the ones we have yet to capture, some of them we don't even know what their call actually sounds like. Some of them are just known from a very small, very remote area. And so we expect that we will receive some of these over the coming months and years. Not all frog species are recorded equally, of course. So something like the very aptly named Crinia significa, which is common eastern froglet, which is the top one there, has been recorded over 50,000 times, which is absolutely insane. So this is a very small frog that actually was very poorly recorded, like sort of documented before, because you can rarely, I've probably seen 20 of them in my entire life. They're calling everywhere, but they're just really, really hard to find. And some species only recorded a few times. And what have we found? Well, we found things like, for example, the good old green tree frog. We thought maybe it was missing from Sydney. It didn't seem to be as common. It used to be really, really common across a lot of Australia, including Sydney. Even in the inner suburbs, we realised that actually the green tree frog is almost gone from Sydney. So it used to be in Mossman, it used to be in Cronulla, and really it's just hanging on the edges. So it's giving us some information on the disappearing frogs, as well as common frogs like the common eastern froglet. We do get the most records from common frogs, but we also have really huge success when local communities take up the cause, use FrogID as a tool to monitor their local frogs. And this photo of the threatened species here is Sloane's froglet, which is a tiny winter breeding frog from around Albury primarily. It used to be a lot more sort of widely distributed. It's endangered now. And I think it's probably quadrupled the number of records of this frog since FrogID than we'd ever had before. FrogID is also helping us understand the impact and the spread of introduced species, in this case, the cane toad, but also, more surprisingly, helping us understand how common it is that native species are actually hitchhiking a ride and actually being transported via produce or nursery supplies to other areas and establishing populations outside their native range, which of course could have consequences for the local frogs. And if you're interested in more of the science, we've been working desperately to get as many papers out as possible to demonstrate how important FrogID is in understanding frogs and informing their conservation. And so you can go to the FrogID website science page to read more. But one of the greatest demonstrations of the power of people and citizen science and FrogID to understanding and conserving wildlife came unexpectedly via the bushfires that hit Australia last summer, and that I think we're probably all too familiar with. Enormous part of Australia's forests and frog habitat went up in flames, and as I watched the news and saw the smoke on the horizon, I thought that the frogs would be evaporating. In February, once it had rained a little bit and it was safe to head out into some of these places, I did personally venture out myself and had a look at some of the places that I'd been surveying for frogs. And during the day, looking at the former frog habitat, I was terrified to think what had happened to these poor tiny little frogs. And I was desperate to start getting out there and doing some survey work. But of course, not long after it had, we could just get out there, we could just try and understand what was happening with Australia's wildlife after these fires, COVID hit, and scientists like myself weren't able to travel and try and understand what was going on. And so there was this huge fear that we actually would have essentially an entire year without any understanding of what was going on with our wildlife. But was that true? Well, no. And thanks to the sort of hundreds of thousands of people, or at least the tens of thousands of people across Australia, people had recorded frogs in areas that were burnt in these fires before, and they continued to immediately after the fires. So this is again the map of the FrogID records in red with the sort of extent of the fire overlaid in grey. And these are photographs that people submitted at the time of recording frogs for FrogID as well. So people got out there, they listened for frogs, they recorded frogs, they took habitat photos, and they submitted them. And we were asking, from our homes in many cases, if anyone can safely get out into these fire zones, or if their backyard, then please do record frogs, because we really we're basing all of our conservation sort of prioritization on sort of best guesses rather than data. There really wasn't that much data, and this was an opportunity to actually get that data. So immediately, sort of in the first up to 125 days post-fire, we wanted to understand what was going on. Before we could get out there, what had people sort of managed to gather about frogs and how they were doing post-fire. And we used 3 sources of data to do this. And one, of course, was the FrogID records. 2 was the National Indicative Fire Extent, which you can see in grey here. And that's just a really a rough idea, as good as you can get of where the fires were, as kind of a boundary of the fire zone. And then we used a third data set, which is the Digital Earth Australia hotspots. And as it gives you an idea of timing and the intensity of the fires, as satellite sensors passing over, they record temperature. So by understanding when the highest temperature occurred, we were able to split the FrogID records into pre and post fire and get an understanding of what the intensity of the fire was like roughly in that area. And when the fire front passed. And obviously this is remote sensing data, so there's a lots of, potential issues on a fine scale of how well, that fires don't burn particularly evenly, so some areas may not be as burnt as others. But yeah, this was the best available remote sensing data combined with the FrogID data at that time. And what we found was that we had 400 users that had contributed to this data just in the southeast part of Australia. We restricted it at this stage. We had about 1,600 pre-fire records of frogs, and at that time, about 630 post-fire records of frogs, of 45 species of frogs were detected post-fire. And what was amazing was that we actually found that any species that were recorded with more than 5 times before the fires in these areas were actually all detected after the fires if they were likely to call at that time of year. So there was no obviously missing frog species, which was fantastic. And we also found that some species were calling only a couple of days after the fires. In most instances, the frogs really got going in February when there was rain. So a year on, we have even more data, and looking across Australia now, we have colleagues and students working on having a look at a wider scale across Australia of the impact of the fires, and longer term now that we've got even more information. And so we have 110 species of frog recorded in the area post-fire, which is fantastic, and this is getting more and more data on a daily basis. So what FrogID has taught me over the last, it's taught me many things, but a couple of the things it's taught me, particularly in relation to fire, is that actually frogs are far more resilient than maybe we would have given them credit for in response to fire. Now, they're still in a whole world of trouble, and many species that are particularly range restricted and up in the rainforest are likely to actually fare far worse than a lot of the frogs that we're detecting. But for species like this endangered southern barred frog, it actually seems that they're actually not super affected in the short term anyway, in a year since fire, and venturing into streams myself and looking for these guys, I've actually never seen so many of these frogs, even in sort of ash-laden streams that are still black on the bottom and the vegetation hasn't grown back perfectly. I've actually never seen so many tadpoles of these guys, which is really great news. And, you know, given the chance, frogs do have the ability to bounce back. It's sort of the combination of everything hitting them at once, the habitat loss, the disease, the fires, the drought, the climate change that is actually likely to be the kicker. But what is, I guess, hopeful for me is that we are getting this fantastic news, and that is thanks to people across Australia as well as scientific surveys. The other thing that it's really taught me is that frog biologists and conservation biologists like myself, we're not alone. And that there are people across Australia that are willing to stand in the rain and record frogs, that are willing to go out into burnt areas after the fire, specifically to try and help us understand how frogs are doing. And I think that is the only way that we can actually have any chance of having future generations inherit a world with as much remarkable biodiversity as we have now. So FrogID has been absolutely amazing, not only in the huge, amazing volume of data that we've been receiving, but also in the, I guess, the realization that there are people across Australia that do care. There's a huge number of people and that are helping make a difference to wildlife conservation in Australia. Thank you.
Jodi, that was absolutely awesome, really inspiring. And I have to say, I have FrogID on my phone. I do love it. It's such an easy application to use. So that brings us to our question and answer session for both of our speakers. So again, please keep putting your questions into the Q&A bar or box down at the bottom. And I'll ask them for Jodi and Richard now. I do note that some of the questions have already been answered. Richard was answering a few while we were going through. We might actually try and take some of those live as well, of course, for the benefit of the recording, because people won't be able to.
I was still listening to Jodi, of course.
Of course. Of course, they're both wonderful presentations, so thank you so much. So one of the questions that's come up live is for Richard. It says, thanks for the amazing work you guys are doing. One question, how did you collect data to find out the kangaroos are mainly responsible for reducing seed-eating bird populations?
Yeah, so it was Dr. James Rees, who was a PhD student who collected all the data, but he collected data on bird communities where there were dingoes, so in South Australia and Queensland, and where there weren't dingoes in New South Wales. And that's where he found the difference in the seed-eating communities of birds. He looked at all birds, but the seed-eating birds were depressed in their numbers in New South Wales. And given the changes that had occurred in places where we had exclosures where kangaroos were excluded, there were more seeds in those areas than in control areas.
Awesome. So it says, thanks, Jodi, for your fantastic presentation and project. Is it possible to view a map of submitted frog records by species from your FrogID project within a specific geographical area, for example, a local government area? That would be very useful for land managers.
There is. So we have a live map that's on the FrogID website that has FrogID records by local council or local government area and also by species. So you can check that out. They are not precise records. When we leave out some threatened species, we on the other tab there, we also have every year we release a data set that has been triple, double, quadruple checked and looked over for the public. And so that data set is released for public use on an annual basis. And we do, though, buffer sensitive species records because we're very worried for frogs. FrogID records represent a calling frog at a breeding site, and many frog species can be disturbed while they're breeding. You know, they call in little nests. And so we don't reveal really threatened species exact locality. facilities, except if you request it from FrogID, and then we give you a data license and things. So we provide the public data sets on an annual basis with some records buffered, and then we provide state governments with the full data sets and anybody that wants to request, you know, more information as well. So our intent is to make sure that this information is used for conservation decisions. So yes, definitely.
Cool. And one more question for you, Jody. Are there many reasons why frogs call, or is it mainly to attract a mate?
The call that you hear sort of repeatedly from your backyard pond, that's a male calling to attract a mate. So it's largely the advertisement call. Sometimes they also have little territorial calls. So it's like a noise to tell the boy frogs to get away as well, like this is my spot. And some of them incorporate that into their normal call. So the little dwarf tree frog, which is along much of Eastern Australia, it sort of calls to attract females like, Ree! And then if it wants to tell males to go away, it goes, eh, eh. And so if there's more males in a spot, they'll make more of the noises. They do have other noises that they can make, like if a snake grabs them, you'll actually hear a frog scream. But generally the noises that you hear are males singing to attract female frogs. So it's like little frog love songs.
Yeah. And another great question has come in saying, are there still areas, this is for Jody, that were fire affected that you still need post-fire recordings from?
Yes, a lot. So you can check out that map on the FrogID website to see where the recordings have come through, but basically anywhere. I mean, the other thing that we get and under sort of, I guess we don't communicate enough, or it doesn't get across, is even if it's your backyard frog, or even if it has a record of a frog, we need frogs over time as well. So we want to understand the impacts of weather on climate and how frogs are going to respond to climate change. And so even recording that same frog every single night, we love, because we need these recordings over time as well as space. So any areas that are burnt are super priority, and it doesn't matter if it's in that sort of I guess wherever you are in Australia, because there's fires going on, you know, in WA's just had a whole number of fires. So every recording helps us understand frogs better and inform conservation.
Yeah. So one of the questions, and I know you typed an answer into this, but so we have it for the recording. What data would you want to capture that isn't yet possible to capture, but you foresee that emerging technology could help with?
Look, I think there's real opportunities to track individual animals and interactions if you've got trackers on some of these animals in real time, but also collect that data on what's actually happening there. Because, I mean, we have so many sort of small grabs of data in time and space. And so being able to quantify that, work out ways of collecting that data with drones, satellite imagery. I think that's the sort of next stage where we can really manage what's going on and learn a lot faster than we're able to at the moment.
Awesome. And there's a couple of questions here. I'll put them together, although they're not quite the same. One is, are there plans to reintroduce dingoes to Sturt National Park area? And the other one's about the role that feral pigs have in your research as a predator and impact on the ecosystem.
Yeah, so just a reminder, there are dingoes in Queensland and South Australia on the other side of the what's called the dingo fence, which separates them out, and dingoes are kept out of New South Wales and Sturt National Park. And that's a policy of the New South Wales government not to have dingoes there because of their impact on sheep farmers. So those dingoes are changing ecosystems, the same ecosystems essentially on both sides of the fences. So you find more kangaroos in New South Wales because there's nothing to eat them. And you actually find more cats and foxes in New South Wales because dingoes prey on those and keep their numbers low, which means that small mammals actually do a bit better in the presence of dingoes because the cats and foxes are kept at low numbers. And then the other question was about pigs. Yeah, I mean, there were some domestic pigs released there. I don't know why. But we occasionally get a feral pig from Queensland. But as far as I know, there are no pigs there currently, and we aim to keep it that way.
Awesome. Actually, I have a quiet little question of my own for Jody, which is, I know when you're using the FrogID app, it'll come back and tell you that it's not a frog, or we might be picking up that it's an unidentified frog. So I just had a question about how does the app know that? And then how can I as a user, is there an easy way to distinguish?
They all come through to us, and we're the ones that listen to it. We do get a lot of insects, and it is really hard to tell an insect from a frog. The common eastern froglet, which is the most commonly recorded frog, really sounds like an insect, and I think a lot of people don't realize that's what they're hearing in the flooded, puddle. So it's hard. Some of them honestly confuse us, and so we actually send it around, and sometimes I'll send Richard or a colleague, is this a bird? Like, we're just, we're not even sure, or the alternative could be it's an undescribed species of frog, which is very possible. We have had some things that we're actually really not sure if it's an undescribed species of frog, which is really interesting. So I guess it's a learning process. If you're not sure what it is, submit it. We'll let you know to the best of our ability. And then who knows, those calls don't get deleted. So they might be really useful in other things in the future.
Yeah. So are there lots of sort of publicly available data sets of these calls so that eventually we can use some machine learning over top of that to start getting machines to be able to go through their databases and say, this is a bird, this is a frog?
Yeah, so we are exploring artificial intelligence machine learning, because obviously one of the biggest obstacles to getting that kind of, the recognizer for the species going is having that data to actually put into the models to sort of increase accuracy. So at the moment we're collaborating on cane toad recognizer in particular, but we do hope in the future it will help at least take off some things. I guess the issue is it's hard. The recordings aren't always a great quality. You can have up to 13 species calling at once, and you can have insects and birds and everything and people talking overlaid on that. And so at the moment, the kind of, data, the kind of responses that you get might be, it's 80% sure it's this frog. And that's not good enough at the moment. So we're definitely trying to love to get any kind of partners together, try and explore this more. We have the best sort of data set to enable machine learning and recognition of calls, but it's a really tricky space. So we're really keen to explore avenues there.
Yeah, really exciting. And this might be a slightly related question. Sorry, it's just popped out of my screen, but someone was asking, for Jody, are there any honors, master's research opportunities to work with the data set?
There are. So you can just request data if you want. So we do have a data request form, but I do have some amazing students, some of them co-supervised with Richard, that are actually using the FrogID data set to answer questions not only about frogs and their conservation, but also about citizen science and how we can get better data and better informed conservation as well.
Cool. I've just got a great question in for both Richard and Jody. So Jody, I'll throw it to you first. What are some of the things data folk can help with without much ecological background knowledge?
Well, I think collaboration, I think, is probably the key. So working with people like Richard and myself that understand either the ecosystem or the taxa and some of the questions around it. Personally, everything I've done with FrogID has been a collaboration with a data scientist, really. So as Corey Callahan, who's worked with Richard and myself. So I don't have that kind of background. So I think it is these kind of collaborations to help answer the questions that are most important. And so for FrogID, some of the questions in terms of, it is some frog related questions, but also things like, how can we improve things in the future? How can we get machine learning into this and help the process? And, as we get an increasingly bigger data set, how do we manage it? Things like that.
Awesome. And Richard, if I can get you to answer that one quickly, because we're getting close to one.
Yeah, same sort of deal as Jody was saying. I mean, I think there are great opportunities in machine learning. We, for example, at Wild Deserts, we have camera traps set up everywhere, which anything that moves gets trapped in a camera, but then we have to sort those out. And I think we had 250,000 photos to go through in 2 months. And so you sort of think about that amount of data, and clearly the great leaps forward are being able to sort the wheat from the chaff, so that you've only got the key data and you can record the things that you want without the individual necessarily doing them all.
All right. Thank you both so much. We are getting very close to 1 o'clock, so I am going to wrap it up. I think we've got to most of the questions. And I apologize to anyone if I didn't get a chance to get your question on air. So I hope everyone will join me in thanking both of our speakers for sharing such great talks with us today. Jodi and Richard, you were both inspirational. I love your work, and it was a great honor to have you as our guests today. So thank you to all our participants as well, and we hope to see you again at our next event. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.